Welcome to the second talk on treatment-resistant interventions. My name is Spencer Back. I'll be the moderator for today. If during the talk, if you have questions, if you'll please hold them to the end or you can enter them into the chat and I can read them to Dr. Ludke when she finishes. And let me introduce Dr. Ludke. She is the program manager for the PTSD and MST programs at the Phoenix VA healthcare system. She is a CBCT for PTSD national trainer and consultant, and very excited to have her talk about the upcoming MDMA research. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Ludke.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Beck. I'm going to be sharing a little bit about MDMA, cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy for PTSD. So I'll give a little bit of background on some of the history of MDMA and how it's been used in psychotherapy and kind of where a lot of our current and future VA studies around PTSD are hopefully headed. I'm not going to try to pronounce that, so I'm just going to call it MDMA. If anybody knows how to, bonus points for you. Maybe by the end of my study, I'll know how to pronounce it. Just a little quick disclaimer. So I do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose. These views are based on research of my own, not necessarily the government. I did want to make a point that MDMA is expected to have FDA approval in 2024. Until then, though, it is still considered a Schedule I substance and restricted to just clinical trials. And I also want to give a shout out to our future MDMA CBCT study therapist, Drs. Courtney Baker, Veronica High, Chris Ogle, and Mike O'Connor. So all of these folks work here at the Phoenix VA and have been through MDMA therapist training, as well as training in the couples therapy for PTSD. And so they will be working with me in the future. All right, so this is just kind of an overview of what I'll be talking about, the mechanisms of action and why we feel that MDMA might be a big game changer when it comes to trauma response. We'll talk about how non-ordinary states of consciousness play an impact on the therapeutic process, talk a little bit about the FDA trials that have been done, phases 1, 2, and 3, as well as share a little bit about some of the other VAs that are doing some research around psychedelics and MDMA in particular. I'll share a little bit about kind of a brief overview of the cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy for PTSD that, as Dr. Beck mentioned, I'm a trainer and consultant for that in the VA system for about 10 years now. And so I'll just kind of give an overview of that protocol and that evidence-based therapy that we currently provide in the PTSD program. And then I'll talk a little bit about our future study. A little bit of background on MDMA. So throughout history, non-ordinary states of consciousness has been part of different healing and spiritual practices across various different cultures. And so Native Americans have been using this in the church. In 1918, they started using peyote as a sacrament. In Mexico, they've also used psilocybin for ceremonial practices. I know that the Amazonian shamanism has used ayahuasca for therapeutic purposes. And so really this slide is just kind of giving respect to those that have come before us and have used psychedelics as healing practices in non-Western civilizations, and give credit to them and their cultural practices for really guiding the MDMA-assisted therapy that we're proposing to use. All right, and just a little bit of background. So MDMA was developed by a German pharmaceutical company, Merck, in 1912. It was first legally used as an adjunct to psychotherapy in the 70s. And so MDMA gained a small following among psychiatrists in the 70s and 80s, despite the fact that the drug had not undergone any sort of formal clinical trials, nor received approval from FDA. Some psychiatrists believe that it enhanced communication in patient sessions and allowed them to really kind of dig deeper and achieve more insights about their problems and challenges. It was also used during that time as more recreational, so it became more widely used recreationally on the streets in the 80s, and that's when the government and DEA stepped in 1985, the DEA declared it to be a Schedule I drug, so it declared an emergency ban. If you're familiar, so a Scheduled I drug is where basically they don't believe that it has any accepted medical use and it's a high potential for abuse. And so since 1985, MDMA has remained a Schedule I drug on that list. 1986, Rick Doblin started the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. And this is a 501c tax-exempt charity that is funded. Also, they have a public benefit corporation, which uses funds and donations to look at various research. And I'll talk a little bit about their phase 3 trials and what they've found over the years. So this is a little bit of a timeline of MAPS since 1986 and kind of their progress in looking at psychedelic studies. So 1992 was the first phase 1 human safety study. 2004, they rolled out the phase 2 trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. In 2017, the FDA designated it as a breakthrough drug. And so really what a breakthrough therapy is a drug that treats a life-threatening condition. So preliminary evidence demonstrated the drug may represent a substantial improvement over available therapies. And so the FDA reviewed this and placed it on a fast track to expedite reviews and approvals for research. In 2018, the first phase 3 trial began enrollment. In 2022, expanded access begins enrollment at other selected sites. And just to note, all of the phase 3 data has been submitted. So they have put the application into the FDA for approval this past quarter, and they're hoping for full approval in June 2024. Fingers crossed. All right, and so some of the just kind of overarching benefits of MDMA is that it's obviously been shown to be useful in treating PTSD. And so we know PTSD is a very prevalent issue, particularly with military and combat veterans. So over $3 billion is spent on PTSD care in a year, $17 billion on service connection for PTSD. And just to kind of compare that to MDMA assisted therapies, is that the phase 3 study cost around $11,537 per patient. And for every 1,000 patients treated, it gives a 30-year savings to the medical system of approximately $132.9 million. So for people who like numbers and money, that's a good incentive to look into this further. All right, so the mechanism of action. And so with a microdose of MDMA, so patients see an increase in the release of what we call like the feel-good neurotransmitters. So these are things like serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. And the main kind of benefit is the release of serotonin. So serotonin also causes the release of a neurohormone called oxytocin. And so oxytocin has been shown to increase the pair bonding and the social affiliation in mammals, as well as it has facilitated interpersonal trust and attachment between humans in previous studies. So MDMA stimulates the release of the oxytocin, contributes to that enhanced bonding and trust, particularly between patients and their practitioners during those psychotherapy sessions. So we see things like increased empathy, openness, increased receptivity. Whoops. Sorry, I just realized that my computer was unplugged, so my battery was running low. So, all right. So yeah, so we see an increase in things like positive affect or mood. We see a more kind of deeper level or increased disclosure of emotional content, and also increased social engagement. And so I have the little picture there of an octopus. And so I won't go into detail, but if you want to look that up, it's a really cool study that they actually looked at giving MDMA to octopus. And so if you're familiar with the animal, is that they tend to kind of live in isolation and they don't really connect other than mating. And so they had this cool study where they had octopus in the same tank where one was kind of like covered in like a mesh to protect them from fighting or anything like that. And so when they dosed the free swimming octopus with MDMA, they actually saw that instead of staying on the other side of the tank like they did without the MDMA, they would actually swim over to the other octopus, and then they would mimic things almost like dancing underwater and trying to kind of simulating almost like trying to hug the other octopus. And so I think that's a cute little demonstration of how it does really increase that empathy and that kind of connection and bonding that we also have seen in the PTSD trials. So just another graph of the neurotransmitters that I said are kind of the most significant in MDMA. And so you can see that the serotonin helps to elevate the mood, decrease anxiety and fear, increase self-esteem and confidence, and alter perceptions. Also, the cortisol and norepinephrine helps with that emotional learning and activation. And as I mentioned, the oxytocin, prolactin helps to increase that trust and empathy. Also decreases our defensiveness. And so I'll talk a little bit later why we feel like the couples therapy in particular will be significantly impacted by the MDMA to increase that connection and less defensiveness and increased communication within couples. All right, and so the most common side effects that they've found in the research of MDMA is that it can temporarily increase blood pressure and pulse. And so this is something that is monitored prior to the sessions. They meet with a doctor, they go through different like heart tests, blood pressure tests. This is continued to be monitored throughout the experiential session when they take the MDMA as well. So there's different periods of time where the therapist will stop and kind of make sure and check the blood pressure and pulse of the participant. So we know that no drug is without risks, but if you look at the slide, you can probably, tell that there's nothing that's really significant or life-threatening. So the most common side effects are things like muscle tightness, decreased appetite, nausea, sweating, feeling cold, eyes, the pupils dilating, and a feeling of restlessness. And it mentions there too that MDMA has been administered to nearly 2,000 people in clinical studies with only one serious adverse event with no lasting harm. And so I believe, I have a safety slide here that kind of shows what the previous trials have shown. So 0 participants in MDMA group experienced suicidal ideation or a suicide attempt, whereas 2 participants in the placebo group that actually did not receive the MDMA did have one person that had suicidal ideation, was hospitalized, and another had intent and was hospitalized, but no actual attempts on their life. 0% MDMA group cardiovascular concerns, 2% in the placebo, and did not find any abuse potential following any of these studies. And I will note too that there are several contraindications of doing MDMA assisted therapy. And so we wouldn't enroll anybody who, say, was pregnant, their primary concern was a psychotic disorder, any sort of kind of mania or uncontrolled bipolar, pre-existing cardiac disease, high risk for suicide, those kinds of things. So we definitely look into those. We undergo evaluations, labs, also take a lot of measures on PTSD symptoms and suicide and mood as well. Oops. All right, and so some other potential benefits. So we do know that non-ordinary states of consciousness may bring about different perceptual changes. So we see a lot of like heightened senses, kind of a loss of time, a lot of amazement, awe, deep sense of insight. You can have extreme states. So we have seen individuals with PTSD that have dissociation or flashbacks, maybe some intense anxiety or panic, paranoia. And so these aren't necessarily considered bad things in the therapy, but we really trust the process and wherever it takes us, and work with the patient to kind of move through that. And that also builds, again, that self-confidence and that self-esteem that I can handle difficult emotions and I'm okay. Some common fears that we see are fear of losing control or being unable to let go, worry about doing it wrong. A lot of transpersonal experiences are reported. So things like kind of loss of ego, some report almost feeling as if like it's a rebirthing experience or like a spiritual quest. Some have reported feeling as if they kind of can communicate with, those beyond. So maybe family members or battle buddies or ancestors, past lives. Some report spiritual connection, so feeling as if they connect with the spirit, God, Allah, other God figures, or even just kind of identification with like an animal or some sort of symbolism of their journey. All right, and so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the FDA trials. So this is a slide that kind of overviews what the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy protocol looks like in itself. And so lots of screening and enrollment prior to initiating, entering somebody into the trial. And so then you have 3 preparatory sessions. And so prep sessions are usually about 90 minutes. And this is where you cover informed consent, you gather history and background of the participant, and you continually consent and discuss the process of the MDMA-assisted therapy. So you talk through, what the experiential session may look like. You also review therapeutic touch and consent to touch. And so, again, a lot of times people will report that they, want a sense of like having the therapist place their hand on their shoulder, possibly even holding their hand, something to make them feel kind of safe and grounded when they're under the influence of the MDMA. And you also help them set boundaries and discuss kind of the theory behind the drug and the therapy. And the MDMA session, it lasts about 8 hours. This is to make sure that the drug is completely out of the person's system. And this is always done in pairs. So you have 2 therapists working with the patient together. So it's never a one-on-one. So you always have 2 people there. As you can imagine, as a therapist as well, that 8 hours is a very long time. So this also allows for therapists to be able to take a break, engage in self-care, have a snack, whatever they need to kind of sustain that attention and that support for 8 hours. And so following the MDMA session, you have integration sessions. And so you have that the next day and over the course of the week. And this is really where we help them kind of apply and process the insights that they learned during their experiential sessions. And then really the process just repeats itself twice over for a total of 3 experiential sessions. When MDMA is FDA approved, we're not quite sure, as far as if they'll limit the amount of experiential sessions. There's a study going on right now that's comparing 2 MDMA sessions versus the 3 to see if there's a difference or if there's comparable improvements after just 2. So that's kind of an overview. And then this slide just kind of demonstrates the MAPS phases and as far as diversity in the participants. And so I purposely included this slide to highlight how direct measures were taken by MAPS to increase the diversity characteristics between phases 1 and 2. So they did this by changing up recruiting strategies. So looking at ways to recruit more from community mental health organizations, working around systemic barriers like taking time off work, losing pay, and look to include participants with varying gender identities as well and sexual orientation. So in phase 2, I think it was 22% of study participants identified as LGBTQI. While this is still lower than maybe we hope, a 2021 survey suggested that 5 to 6% of the population identifies as LGBTQI. So it's still a little bit higher than what we would see in the population. I didn't include this in the slide, but I did want to note too that they've also looked to improve diversity of MDMA therapists. So the last phase, phase 3, had 51% of current therapists identifying as BIPOC and 30% identifying as LGBTQI. All right, and here is the phase 3 trial results. I particularly like this slide. I think it's simple, but it's very powerful. So you can see that 67% of the ones in the MDMA-assisted therapy lost a PTSD diagnosis. So that means like on the cutoff of the CAPS, which is the clinician-administered PTSD scale and kind of our gold standard for PTSD treatment, or assessment, you'll see that 67% of folks fell below that line. So they had subclinical PTSD. 21% had a clinically meaningful response. And you can see that compared to the placebo, the large difference. And when we say clinically meaningful, we mean at least 15 points or more on that CAPS assessment severity score. And I will say too that 94% of the participants reported that they felt like more MDMA sessions would have been helpful. And so that, again, that's why it's important for the FDA and our clinical trials to kind of look at what is the recommendation for amounts of MDMA trials. So I included this slide, and since we don't have a lot of time, and I'm not tech savvy, and I'll probably mess it up, I just wanted to include this slide to show you a little clip if you want to kind of jot that down as in your notes. It's a short, maybe 6-7 minute YouTube clip, but it shows a combat veteran who was on the verge of committing suicide, had tried many different PTSD treatments and wasn't getting any relief. And it was in one of the trials using MDMA, and kind of speaks to his experience. And he's also been a very big advocate for more research around psychedelics in Washington, D.C. So definitely a really cool video to really show the impact and the power of this potential therapy. All right, and this is just kind of an overview again of kind of what we're aiming for. So, you know, the body is extremely complex and also has a sophisticated healing process. And so when you think about it, you know, we kind of liken it to like if you were to get a cut and you go to the emergency room, is that, you know, you can have a doctor kind of, you know, remove any physical obstacles to healing, help create favorable healing, but it's really the body that kind of does the healing process. And we think about that similarly in MDMA assisted therapy, is that really it's the participant and the person engaging in that kind of inner healing. And the therapists are there more as a guide, creating a safe space for people to be able to kind of go to that deeper level and really kind of process things. So we always encourage, you know, participants, we encourage them to consider that they have that wisdom and knowledge and ability and capability. And so it's really about just kind of creating that space. So the therapist role, yeah, is very, very non-directive. So it can feel a little bit different, considering that we do a lot of kind of cognitive behavioral therapies for PTSD typically, where we have worksheets, we're helping teach and guide and educate and kind of work through things. We might have agendas with certain topics. So this can feel like a big shift for therapists in that it is more of the non-doing. So we're not pushing for a particular experience. We don't have a kind of an agenda. It's really about being curious to whatever comes up for the participant in that moment, and also trusting that whatever emerges is really what's needed in that kind of service of healing. And so it's inner-directed. Again, the participant is encouraged to kind of go inward. And I'll talk a little bit more kind of like what it looks like in the session. But really, again, it's not a technique, but more of an attitude towards, or a philosophical stance towards the therapy approach. Really builds on that relationship with inner healing and really encouraging participants' awareness, and always kind of encouraging them too that whatever is coming up is what needs to be there as well too. Sometimes participants come in with maybe their own agenda or hopes and kind of what they want the session to be like, or what they're hoping to get out of that, and just really supporting people to kind of embrace where they are at that moment. Hopefully you can see this slide. I know the boxes are probably a little difficult to read, but this kind of demonstrates the participants kind of the process when they take the medication. And so you'll see that between 0 and 2 hours, that's really where they're provided the medication, they're talking to the therapist, kind of waiting for it to kind of kick in. And so once that medicine starts to take place and starts to impact the person, a lot of times we ask them to, so they're laying on like a bed, something comfortable. We have blankets, pillows, eye shades, headphones. So you're really kind of encouraging them, once the medication starts to kick in, is that you want them to kind of go more inward again, just to experience, the felt sense of the body, what kind of emotions are coming up, thoughts, just really being able to focus on themselves. And you'll see at that top box, if you can read it, is that there's a little thing about music. And so music is very powerful in the process with the MDMA. And so we had lots of specific trainings on what kind of music to pick, the different beats. You don't want anything with words, because again, that can kind of possibly guide the MDMA experience. And so in the beginning, it's slower, it's spacious, it's welcoming, it's really trying to cultivate that curiosity to what's about to come, and kind of just having that non-judgment openness. Between 2 and 5.5 hours, there's a little bit of balance between the participant being inward, so maybe lying down with the eye shades, listening to the music, kind of working through whatever might be coming up for them, and also checking in with the participant. And so checking in to see how things are going. You might, at this point, also be checking for blood pressure and making sure that the person's comfortable. If they're starting to become cold, do they need more blankets, and so forth. And so the tempo of the music during this period, where as you can see, the medication is kind of at its peak, is that you really want to kind of match that with what the participant's going through. So you might have some space for kind of more waves, open-ended or open-hearted, deep. And then you might have some things that maybe increase the pace. And so that kind of, again, stimulates different emotions that might come up. After about 5.5 hours, you'll see that the participant starts to come down from the medication. And so this tends to be more relational, more checking in with the therapist, maybe sharing some of the insights that they've had, or those kind of aha moments. And the music also becomes a little bit more slower, more relaxing, while they're kind of integrating some of those experiences that they've just had. And then they approach the new baseline, and then the medication is out of their system. And then we always have somebody kind of, either they stay on site for some of the studies previously, or they go home with a loved one that drives them home to just ensure safety. And then the next day, which I'll talk a little bit about, is the integration. So just some cultural considerations to be mindful of too, is that you really want to, this isn't a treatment that we would recommend as like a frontline first-time treatment. That this really should be about who is appropriate. Have they tried kind of a lower level of care? Have they tried other outpatient evidence-based therapies with no success or response, or possibly even residential PTSD treatment with no response? So this isn't something that we would just recommend right away, but we really want to see who is appropriate for this treatment. And also, are they safe to go off of medications? So that is part of the informed consent, and part of the research protocols is to kind of wean themselves off at least like 5 weeks prior. We start to do that process, because we don't want them to be on other medications that might impact the MDMA, or that MDMA impacts medications. And so we really want to talk to folks about that as well too, to see for appropriateness. As far as cultural humility goes too, and so in our work, we always want to be sensitive and humble to how we're different and also similar to our patients. And so particularly when you're introducing a psychedelic, we want to be really mindful of that power imbalance. And so that power differential in that particular setting can be even more heightened due to the vulnerability of taking a substance. And so you really want to be mindful of that. And that's part of those conversations that you have prior to the MDMA sessions. And then also terminations. So I mentioned oxytocin being induced with MDMA and creating that kind of strong bond and connection. And so, as therapists, our goal is to treat PTSD and also discharge back to their lives. And so that can feel very overwhelming to some. And I think phase 3 had a couple people that reported that they felt like it was like likened to cancer treatment or stopping before your surgery is over, is that like they felt like the rug was kind of pulled out, because again, that bond is so extremely strong with the MDMA session that they really wanted to continue, and felt like yeah, they kind of got gypped by having to end early. So being extremely clear with informed consent and termination, and kind of talking about this consistently throughout the process will assist in that. Okay, I'm checking the time, so I'm almost coming up here. So in case there's any questions, I want to make sure that give you guys some time. And so a little background on cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy for PTSD. So this was developed by Doctors Candace Munson and Stephanie Fredman. It's a 15-session manualized therapy. It's 75-minute sessions, and it is a standalone kind of frontline PTSD treatment that we offer in the clinic. The goals are to reduce PTSD symptoms as well as improve relationship functioning. There's 3 phases to this. So we start off with a rationale for treatment, a lot of education around what is PTSD, why do we think some people get stuck with PTSD and don't go through that natural recovery process. We also talk a lot about how it impacts relationships. We look at building safety, look at how avoidance also maintains PTSD, as well as how the partner might be maintaining PTSD by what we call accommodation. So maybe the partner does all the grocery shopping, takes care of the kids, kind of sets the environment to make sure that the veteran with PTSD is not upset, and they kind of build their life around the PTSD through that avoidance. And then phase 3 is focused on more kind of those trauma cognitions that we see that are most affected by PTSD. So things like, how do they make sense, or what's the meaning that they ascribe to the traumatic event? Do they blame themselves, someone else? How has it impacted their views on themselves, their relationship, and the world in general when it comes to things like safety, power and control, trust? And also, how does it affect the emotional closeness and physical closeness that the couple has with one another when PTSD is kind of living in the relationship with them? I'm not going to go through all the studies, but if you're a research nerd like me and you like that stuff, you guys will all get the slides as well, and you can look these up. But just wanted to show that there is a lot of research to show the effectiveness of CBCT. And why would we want to do MDMA and CBCT together? I think it's probably pretty apparent at this point, is that, again, it's that increasing that connection. So reducing those fears and concerns and defenses that you might be hurt by your partner, or that your partner might judge you, enhancing communication. And yeah, so we really think that it can be very powerful, and there has been some previous studies that have shown that. So this is a slide that just shows some of the other CBCT studies. And then you can also see that the Monson et al. 2020, so they actually blended MDMA into the CBCT protocol. This was a trial that was outside of the VA with non-veterans, and you can see the huge difference in effect sizes. So this is PTSD symptoms rated by the patients. You can see much better effect. And also the relationship satisfaction being much larger in the ones that got CBCT and MDMA compared to CBCT alone. And so that's kind of what we are hoping to do here in Phoenix. And so we're in the process of working with MAPS actually on a proposal, and working with our local research department and preparing for an IRB submission, looking at blending the MDMA into the CBCT protocol with 2 experiential sessions and both partners being dosed. So this is kind of like a little overview of what our process will look like. Or we hope, IRB will approve it, and this is what we intend to do. So sessions 1 through 3 of the typical CBCT protocol, we plan to do a mass delivery. And so this is a 3-hour format in one day, virtually or face-to-face. And that's also going to include the preparation sessions prior to the MDMA. Session 4 and 5 is going to be delivered in person the day before. You'll have the MDMA therapy session. The next day, you'll have an integration session. And then following that, we're going to be looking at sessions 6 through 9, again, in that kind of mass dosing several times a week. Sessions 10 and 11 of the CBCT protocol will be done right before the MDMA experience. And those two sessions are trust and control topics. And so that I think will lend very well into the integration or into the MDMA session as far as increasing that trust and empathy with the couple. Have the integration session, and then we'll end the therapy process with the sessions 12 through 15 of the CBCT protocol. And those are things like the emotional closeness, physical intimacy, post-traumatic growth topics. And basically our aims are similar, that we believe that it'll decrease PTSD, increase relationship satisfaction. We're also going to be evaluating the safety, tolerability, and feasibility of this. And hopefully this will lead to a larger randomized controlled trial looking at more participants. So we're going to start off with just 8 couples and again, kind of demonstrate that this can be done in the VA system and that there's benefit to it, and hopefully submit a large trial. This is just a little slide to show you that there's several other VAs that are also looking at psychedelic studies. Loma Linda is doing an MDMA inter-directed therapy. Portland is looking at a group version of MDMA for PTSD. Bronx VA is looking at the 2 versus 3 MDMA sessions. San Diego is doing a briefer version of the couples therapy with just 8 sessions and dosing just 1 of 2 partners. Greater Los Angeles, I can't recall, but they are working on something. We have a call this afternoon, so I'll find out. And then us. Did some references, and then, yeah, I can open it up to questions. I think we got about, or I don't know if Spencer's on there. Any questions in the chat?
We have until 11:55. There haven't been any questions in the chat just yet, but I was curious, is MAPS doing research with other disorders other than PTSD, like depression, anxiety?
So they are doing studies on like psilocybin and depression. And I don't know if they did any previous ketamine like years back, but they are doing, I know that they're also doing some other psychedelics with like depression. And
okay,
I don't know as much about the psilocybin stuff though.
All right, if you do have questions, feel free to come off mute, or you can feel free to just type it into the chat.
And thank you for putting that link in there too. Appreciate it.
No problem.
So we have a question for one of the people that's in person here in the Tucson location. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, go for it.
All right, perfect. So the gentleman that's in person said that you had talked about some of the studies with the MDMA and the placebo. Are there any correlations between MDMA by itself?
As far as like side effects, or
just there was therapy plus MDMA and then therapy and placebo.
Mhm.
Was there efficacy for MDMA alone without therapy for PTSD, or is the therapy an essential component?
Yeah, the therapy is an essential component because you really want to create that like safe space for them to do it. And so you always have 2 therapists there guiding at least kind of the setting, and it's a very like I said, kind of a non-directive therapy. It's more of a support system. And then also the integration sessions the next day are really important to be able to help the participant make those connections between what might have come up. So maybe they had certain kind of visuals, or maybe they had some memories that popped up, and kind of helping them kind of piece together how they make sense of what their experiences were. I will say it's very hard to do a placebo comparison because when you're on MDMA, it's very like, you're on a medication. And so their pupils are dilated. It's hard to keep therapists blinded to which arm they got of the research study. So I do know that that's something that we're discussing too on another level of too, of like how to make something a little bit more comparative than a placebo. Like, yeah. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. No other questions in the chat.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Ludke. I've heard this talk before and always really impressed with it. I love the story about the octopus. And just kind of the general sense that people know how to heal. I like that underpinning with the MDMA that the therapist will have for the patient.